Matsy, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, we're talking about Philippe Druillet's Urm the Mad. It's part two of his Uragel and Urb saga. So we've read Uragel, and now we're looking at uh, Uragel's Sud, the tragic fruit of the union between Uragel and uh, Safarane. This there's a divine feminine slash city figure that the protagonist is in union with by the end of the first saga, and so now we're seeing this grotesque figure named Urm the Madman, LeFou, who has the potential to either save or doom humanity, and his own tragic quest is played out in this part too. So yeah, I think we're all very excited to talk about Urm the Mad.
So what's interesting is that Druillet just posted on Twitter. He's active on social media, and I do recommend. He's a good follow. And like I said, he posts in English. For being French, it's actually really interesting and accessible. And he just posted that an artist's duty is to challenge perceptions, provoke thought, and to illuminate the unseen. And he definitely kind of, I think, hits his own goals. But I wanted to kind of take a moment to appreciate that I think Urm is in many ways a better work than its predecessor, its progenitor. I
Mm.
think that Irregale is the student art film to the Urm being the auteur director who has a little more experience under his belt and knows how to deliver some mind bending material while also getting you from point A to point B in a narrative sense. There are parts. The more having reread Urm the Mad at this point, it really pointed out, I think, the things that Irregale does well, but also some of the things it doesn't do as well. There are parts of Irregale that I think even fall into, this is going to be almost sacrilegious to some people, but it almost falls into Image Comics territory, which is, hey, this is just a wonderful piece of art. What is it doing for the story? It's just there.
Mm.
It's there because it's a pretty piece of art. And there are moments in Irregale where you're just kind of going, what are we doing with this? It's just, phantasmagoria. I love that word, by the way. Whereas in Urm the Mad, we get phantasmagorical images, but it serves a narrative purpose, and one that is, while still being mysterious and deep and mind expanding, is one that's kind of straightforward. It's got a Grecian, a Greek tragedy angle to it. We kind of have a fated, doomed character similar to Irregale, but this doomed character is put on a journey, a quest to either save or doom humanity, save it from the demons or deliver it to the demons, essentially. And you can plot the progress of that story and follow it pretty easily. Whereas with Irregale, there was a lot of moments where you just kind of scratch your head going, I think this is what might be happening, but it might not totally. In fact, Urm recontextualizes Irregale, and so we actually have a better understanding of what happened in Irregale because of Urm. Because Urm says, he's the son of Irregale and the two mothers, the city enchantress, kind of blended into one. So we kind of get some, it kind of demystifies a little bit of that ambiguous ending a tad. So yeah, I think Urm is actually in many ways a better story.
Yeah, just to underscore something Twitless said, uh, there's something in the dialogue that is a little more accessible, and it's actually kind of interesting how I think a writer, particularly an artist who gets really excited about drawing, how they can get equally excited about making very dense, very turgid language for getting at what they want to do, and they think that they're being very flowery, that they're putting ornamentation on their dialogue, like you see in Uragel, basically in every single panel. And when you make the dialogue, when you make the text as dense as your art, it's actually kind of harder for people to get a handhold, I think, on what you're doing. They need kind of something that's at eye level, so to speak, that they can grab on easily, and then they need something that takes a little bit more of a risk that they can reach up towards. And I think in Urm the Mad, when Urm just screams like, "I hate the gods," like that's actually pretty straightforward. And there's actually a lot of complexity behind that. I think it takes the experienced writer, honestly, to write simple sentences and write them well. And then from that handhold in the dialogue, then you can do something a lot more phantasmagorical with the illustrations. But people feel like they still have an anchor. They can still they instinctively quickly find where they need to be in the story from page to page. Like sometimes that could be in the art. The art can be simple, and the text could, the language, the stuff in the speech bubbles and the boxes could be complex. But it's actually kind of it's actually kind of nice that you could just kind of land on the words, and then from the words you can go explore and deal with a lot more complicated stuff that you're not always entirely sure what you're looking at. But you have the context of the text of the words to anchor you. So it's very well paired.
So I think this review might end up being more of a debate between me and the two of you about which book was better.
Oh
I
no.
preferred Ida Gale,
Okay.
and
That
I
does not surprise me.
and actually I
That
think
makes sense.
it's more in keeping with Druillet's quote that you read, Twitless, from Twitter. He said, "An artist's duty is to challenge perceptions, to provoke thought, and to illuminate the unseen." As far as illuminate the unseen, I think Ida Gale definitely falls much more strongly in that category.
Yeah.
Druillet was trying to put on the page his perception of the creation of space, time, and human civilization. You understand? And he was referencing so many elements from his own subconscious. And it was really a strong meditation on all of these supernatural, metaphysical elements that I agree they weren't strongly narrative driven, but he was trying to delve into a lot of the conflicts that man experiences. First of all, by illustrating for us this very vastly unknown concept of what our origins are as a species, not just in space and time, but also here on Earth. But then also wrestling with our place um, in that dynamic. Now that we've come to this point, and where do we fit in with these elements that created us, this history that spawned us, and all of these elements that all of these aspects that we grew out of to come to being who we are currently, and trying to overcome and dominate them. And he came up with this story that basically trying to find our rightful place of where we currently belong in history, where we stand, having surpassed and overcome all of this long survival test that we were subjected to, uh, coming out of the wastelands, coming out of our primitive states, coming out of being just the pure manifestation and subjects and playthings of the gods that created us, that are so beyond anything that we could try to understand or try to comprehend. And Druillet formulated all of these very complicated dynamics into this character, Ida Gale, who eventually has nothing to achieve other than full copulation and oneness with everything that is unknown and beyond him. And in that process, it devoured him as an entity. So for me, Ida Gale had a very strong message, a very strong philosophical tract that it was attempting to follow. With Urm, I see the underpinnings of some of that creative powerhouse that Druillet is capable of achieving whenever he approaches a particular work. But I don't see the very strong philosophical undertones that I was seeing with Ida Gale. It's very narrative driven, but because he's trying to emphasize so strongly plot over all of these much larger looming questions, it also is a little bit flatter than Ida Gale was. The conclusion of Urm is that he essentially vanquishes all of his foes and he himself goes off to die in the desert. No longer the playthings of these very human elements that are attempting to toy with him and achieve superiority and dominance, rather than Urm being a character with agency and trying to find his own fixture, his own place. He's a madman. He's an agent of chaos that supplants all of their efforts and plays them all for fools at the end. And he himself finding his own doom at the conclusion of all of this conflict that he experiences. So there isn't as a strong uh, discussion or perspective that was being delivered in Ira Gale about what these forces are and how they manifest in our lives and how we come to terms with them. Urm essentially just disregards them and plays them all for fools, and ultimately demonstrates that they are the ones who were truly mad, forever thinking that they could yield the implicit powers of a madman uh, banished to the deserts to wander forever, never knowing his parents or his destiny.
Let's take a brief pause to hear from the awesome creators joining us today and find out what cool projects they're currently working on.
Hey guys, if you love sword and sandal historical fiction with a healthy dose of ancient Roman and Egyptian fantasy mixed in, then check out Kyrie. We've got 450 pages printed so far, a fourth book on the way. Order your books today at curiecomic.com.
Modern day, classic superhero storytelling. Get The Adventures of Omega Girl, issues 1 through 5, now on Indie Planet.
Thank you to our awesome creators, and now back to the video.
I agree and disagree somewhat with that. And I'm very happy to hear your interpretation of Irrigale. I think you got more out of it.
Beautiful, wasn't it? Like, don't you want to just agree with them just because of how spirited?
Just agree with me. Sure.
No, I'm not saying I agree, but I appreciate, and I think that interpretation is valid. My issue is that it's such a mystery box that there are multiple angles on it. You can walk away from Irrigale with multiple interpretations. I think that's part of the intention. Unfortunately, that puts a lot of the onus on the reader to get something out of the text. And if you don't connect to that text in the way maybe that you did well read, you're gonna get to a different destination. And Druillet is, I think, intentionally doing it that way. I don't think you're supposed to get one answer to it. It's very, but I also want to push against a little bit of the idea of Urm being too simple, because it's simpler. But the end of this, I think, still has some ambiguity and some complexity to it, like any good Grecian tragedy. We look at like Oedipus, right? A doomed character whose only sin is basically being cursed by the gods to have a cursed fate. And there's still some interesting things we can get from it. There's still complexity there. And in both works, Druillet is pulling heavily from a Lovecraftian influence. He actually has a straight pull quote from Lovecraft, the death may die part at the end. And so it's very clear that we're dealing in both stories with cosmic forces that, even if Urm kind of waves his hand in defiance and still strikes a blow in a Michael Moorcock kind of way of sticking his finger in the eye of the Chaos Lords, essentially, it still doesn't end well for him. And that still implies that there's a whole lot beyond him that is well out of his control. The fact that it's even one of the dragons who was supposedly an ally that is the thing that spits venom in his eye and kills him after putting him on the road to supposedly save the universe. The sort of like those little paradoxes there are meant to kind of subvert and undermine a straightforward interpretation of actually what's going on in the cosmic drama. The fact that the Chaos Lords at the end say, yeah, you might have stopped us for a moment, but we're not going anywhere, and you didn't really accomplish anything in the eternal sense. Like, Druillet is still hearkening back to this very heavily influenced Lovecraftian sense of the cosmos is beyond you, and the
pitiless indifference of that, of the hierarchies and the principalities that are governing this universe.
There's a juxtaposition in philosophies between Irrigale and Urm, where in Irrigale, there's a power dynamic, and everything has meaning and everything has intent. And the only way to reconcile all of those is to unify and have assured, agreed upon destruction in in the bond of love, in full intimacy, where
Mm,
the result of that is the birth of new life and new progression that
yeah.
continues forward from that singular unification from two contested forces. In Urm, everything is meaningless, everything is chaos, everything is irreverence. And Urm has no agency. He has no interest in taking the place of his parents on the throne of man that they had created. All of these gods and their machinations of, no, we want to run the earth now, or no, it's the new gods of man that want to run the earth now. And all of them want to vie for Urm's bloodline to be able to achieve their ultimate ends, where they attempt to court the rebirth of the shadow child through Urm's bloodline and utilize him for their own ends to achieve their new power and their new status and dominance in this world. Urm casts off all of them and makes them all as meaningless as his own existence. That's the total madness of this storyline, is that it's not just Urm who is mad, it's everybody who is mad. It's all existence that is mad. It has no purpose. And even the most successful omnipotent character in this storyline, Urm, who comes away defiant and victorious, is so easily cast aside, having been felled by a random lizard in the desert, spitting into his eye and left to
Yeah.
rot in the sand. It's a very strong message that is completely opposite to what we saw at the end of Irigale, where the unification and bond of all of these contested forces and these diverging philosophies of what is our ultimate fate and origin birth new life and new civilizations. Urm is just nothing and oblivion. at the end.
I don't agree with that, and I think that interpretation of Irigale is too positive, because the ending is not. I can see how that is an interpretation, but the text itself is also fairly dark on it. You know, carving out your own orifices. It's like it's this Lovecraftian, like,
In the act of making love, carving out your own orifices.
it's
Do you see the juxtaposition there, the contrast?
it's still not a. The ending does not, until we get Urm, we don't even really know that new life has happened. It's fairly ambiguous exactly what's going on.
See,
Urm actually is the only thing that gives us I think a more definitive take or spin on Irigale. Irigale's ending on its own is fairly fairly oblivion oriented. So I do push back against that. I also don't want to get too far into just rehashing Irigale, because I feel like we could be here all night on that point.
And I spent too much time talking about Orb during the Irigale.
Right, but I want to go back and point out something regarding the art that I think fits the Lovecraftian thing very, very well. And this is something that I think Druillet does, and I really think that people who want to create Lovecraftian art and fiction need to take notes. So there's something that Bande dessinée does or many types of Bande dessinée do, which is make the character small and make the setting big. And so there are panels here. Druillet has entire, spreads where Urm is practically just a little black dot almost, or just barely a black dot against a massive setting, a phantasmagorical cathedral of Lovecraftian horror. And that sense of size and scope, where the character is basically playing second fiddle to the setting. The setting is essentially telling the story in a lot of ways, and
Very
the character
French, I think.
The character is just kind of there for the ride. This fits a Lovecraftian idea so well, because in Western American comics, especially since we have that American spirit of individualism, the superhero, right, is our strongest visual genre in that medium. The character is the most important thing. We center on Superman. We center on Batman. The spread will show Spider-Man, and the city recedes into the background because it's the character who matters the most. And Druillet does the opposite, and the opposite makes points out how insignificant the individual is in scope in comparison towards cosmic forces and fate. They operate far beyond his ken. And if you want to really capture the spirit of Lovecraftian psychological and cosmological horror, Druillet, who is very much taking heavily, just quoting Lovecraft, really has captured that spirit in ways that I don't often see. And I think we should see more of, because there's something about realizing that you're nothing, you're insignificant. The door to this castle that is incalculably big and beyond your understanding is so big that it just makes you look like a speck. And Urm is just, like I said, running through these hallways, and they're not even explained what they stand for. And that goes into the fact that Urm is still channeling some of that mystery and some of those deeper things as he just runs through a mad world, and is just cosmically small.
Something I think is also important to add is we're dealing with the tension between these two volumes, almost as if we're trying to figure out whether one is undermining the other, or if one explains the other through undermining it in a way. And of course it's created by the same person. So there's, to some extent, we have, like, I think we have to let speak for itself and for the previous volume. But that's what's really fun and really interesting with this, because we can't let it do that too much, because there's something to be said for letting Irigel, which was created at a time before we had before we had a volume 2, we just had the volume 1, and that's all the author had created so far. So there's something to be said for also letting that stand on its own. But there's something that always happens, I think, when a creator, particularly when a creator has this much free reign to write and draw his own message. When he does a volume 2, there's almost inevitably like a reconsideration that the author is doing on the previous chapter, so to speak, as he's writing the new chapter. And it's always fun to see where there's like contours and crevices lie, because it can start to feel like he's violating the message that he very confidently put down in the first one. Maybe he changed his mind between volume 1 and 2. Maybe he always had this planned. Maybe he said he always had this plan, but he didn't. And he actually, and I feel like it's actually kind of a strength of this 2-volume saga that it demands consideration and debate in a way, because it's very complex. It's actually not quite simple about how these two puzzle pieces, clearly they're supposed to fit together, and in the complicated imaginative mind of Druillet, it's actually kind of it's not so simple as to how they fit together. So I think each of us have to negotiate that tension in different ways, which is fun.
I see where both of you believe that Irigel ended, and I just disagree. I don't think it ended in oblivion. It clearly ends in procreation out of conflict. It's clearly describing the not the birthing process. It's clearly describing the consummation process, and how a new path forward can be forged, where there were two paths diverging originally, and two self-interested entities that were both vying for dominance. That was the conclusion of Irigel. So definitely not oblivion, definitely not nothingness. Unlike Urm, where he just lies dead, rotting in the sand, where there is nothing to take from that. That's pretty much the concluding arc of both tales, I would argue.
I get cosmic ambiguity from Irigel. I get cosmic joke at the end of Urm. That's sort of where, like, because it's just there's so many ways you can read the ending. It's so unspecific, and I that means you can read that ending. I'm just saying, cosmically ambiguous in Irigel. It's definitely cosmic joke.
Well, and like a good joke, there's going to be some ambiguity there, right? I really like how joke and ambiguity play with each other in that framing, right? Like it's actually it's not quite. There's a cynicism and there's an indifference at the end that there's a dark humor in the end of Urm that I think is fitting and appropriate, that pairs well in its contrast with the ecstasy at the end of Irigel. I really think if you just tried to uh, escalate Orm up through some sort of cosmic cathedral to heavenly consummation again, it would feel very hollow to do that a second time with this two-parter, right? Like, they have to pair in this interesting way. They have to conflict. There have to be these, like, crunchy angles that actually pierce into to each of the different framings of the stories. Like, you have to be more comfortable with one than the other, and it's interesting how we're finding, it turns out not everyone's comfortable with just the one and not the other. Depends on what you're looking for in a story, maybe where you sit a little bit more. I sit a little bit more with Orb because I do like the narrative grounding, and then up from there we can reach and explore into some really complex themes. But it's done, not through just writing like a prose saga, and then illustrating that. Uh, but that's what's really interesting is that they're meant to go together, and they feel like very two different works, and yet they have to be thought of in light of each other, and that's what it's so fun with. It's the sum of the parts. It's greater than the sum of its parts for that conflict and that pairing.
For me, ambiguity is the end of Killing Joke and the question of whether or not Batman killed the Joker. And, those are never clearly defined. So you can argue them endlessly and everybody's going to be right. In Ida Gale, there's clearly a process being described at the end of the story. There's an epilogue of what comes after. And maybe you find a little bit of the description impenetrable to interpret or put into, concrete ideas or direction. It doesn't mean that there isn't some kind of continuation of the arc that was being processed or laid out throughout most of the storyline here, being delivered at the concluding moment. So, to me, there is something of a conclusion that doesn't just suggest that everything is nothing at the end of Ida Gale. But I guess going away from this argument of comparing the two works and how one is derivative of how one is a continuation of the other, and the two are coupled in a narrative sense. Odom is very much about the place of man and not having successfully become gods themselves. And you see in a lot of the pieces that Philippe Druillet illustrates in this book, rather than accentuating a lot of the supernatural bodies that he is considering in Ida Gale, here he focuses much more strongly on the physical. And there's a lot more sexualized components that are being accentuated. There's a lot more exploration of the human body and different dynamics. There's a lot more of festivities and playground of the gods in the human temples, in the human settings. So Urm is very much bringing us back down to the terrestrial. It's taking us out of the cosmological. It's saying that we have successfully defeated the gods. The gods may be still toying with us at the periphery and hoping to bring back their place in the world when the gods are jealous that the humans are now worshiping new gods and they want to be restored as their rightful place as in that hierarchy as being the ones worshipped. They're referring to the human gods. They're referring to the humans that have now been elevated to the level of gods that all the humans have now deferred to as their.
They're also referring to. I think they're also referring to dragons too, because one thing that I think is interesting is that I think there is an interpretation that says that this is like our Earth. I think you could also read this as something completely different. I know it refers to Earth technically in the text a little bit, but that could simply be just a translation thing of like how to refer to a world. Because this very clearly, and there are a couple of references, I think, to Earth cities. So those things were clues, but this is at bare minimum, it's an alt history. This is very much like this is not this is not like Earth as we know it. And so
I don't remember the time when we conquered death and danced around skulls and
right, yeah, and like the gods that Druillet is discussing are not ours, and the dragons that are also kind of gods, and then also show up and kill Urm at the end, who are kind of exerting almost again, are those dragons the new gods? It's not entirely stated. They could be another party or at play. Again, I think we're not like a good Lovecraftian work. I think it's meant to evoke more questions than firm answers. That doesn't mean that everything has that there's no meaning to take from it. Ambiguity just means that there are multiple kind of roads you can take, and maybe that those roads are in a particular grouping, right? So I'd agree that Irigale definitely, whatever road we go down, whether he's in a purgatory of some kind, I do agree that there's a sexual birthing of some kind, but whether we're birthing a demiurge or whether we're doing a Yeats, we're birthing the Antichrist, who knows, and I don't think Druillet is necessarily settled on that question himself. Either way, I'll make this my concluding thought. It is a fascinating read. I think Urm is a more accessible one. So I think if you struggle through Irigale, I think you get more rewarded with Urm. Especially if you want a stronger narrative, I appreciate that. I like the more easily accessible Lovecraftian elements. And again, I would just reiterate to people who do like Lovecraftian stuff. Lovecraft is not just tentacles. Lovecraft is about a tone. It's about deprioritizing things we tend to prioritize in fiction, focusing less on character, more on things outside of character. And Druillet is doing this. He's doing a master class on how to do that type of work. And so I highly recommend perusing this.
Matsy, your final thought.
Yeah, it's a fascinating two-parter, and I love that it's not a trilogy. So it really intensifies this contrast between the two volumes. I love that there's distinctly two different approaches towards telling a story, and the themes feel like they're at very least distinct. They may in some places be in conflict, which is fun. Coming from a single author again, I think is really fun that he wants to put those kind of multitudes in a single work, a 2-volume work, and have you kind of navigate, venture your way through the hazards of that kind of conflict. He doesn't quite resolve it out for you. And again, I mean, it's Druillet is someone who loves drawing. Absolutely loves drawing, and he has fun on every single page. He's not just demanding excellence; he's demanding that he's going to put stuff out there that he has fun with, and it's so contagious to read stories that someone had a blast drawing and producing. So it's absolutely a recommend.
Thank you very much for checking out the video. Subscribe, like, and stay tuned for more.